Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the richest person to ever live. That and more after this. What up, fam? Welcome to Living for Black History. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Smith, and this is the place, this is the space where you need to be to get all of the greatest, fact-based, historian-based, accurate history on Black history. We are here for that very purpose, and at this channel, that is what we give, that is what we do, that is what we talk about. Of course, you know this channel, this information is part of the Living for You channel base, and so what we need you to do is go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe. That is like, comment, and subscribe to this very channel so that you get these updates when we premiere this series that we have been doing for the past few weeks, that we're going to be doing many weeks to come. We want you to be there, so go ahead and like, comment, subscribe. Hit the notification bell also so that you know when it drops and when it premieres, and that you can watch it on the premiere date. Because like I said, this is the channel where you get the accurate, fact-based, historian-based, wonderful history that is Black history. And as I always say, it is fascinating, wonderful, fabulous history. So let's kick it off where we left off last week. Last week, we were continuing our discussion into pre-colonial Africa, right? We have been talking about this since the series premiere. We've been talking about the African experience prior to anyone else coming in. When we say colonialism in Africa, we have to both include the European colonialism as well as the Islamic colonialism that happened. These were both forces that were going to come into Africa outside of the native population that was already there. As we stated before, Africa was considered for a long time by mainstream historians to be a dark continent, and we know as we've gotten deeper and deeper and deeper in the late 19th, early 20th century discoveries and understandings, we realized that it was very, very full. There was a lot going on. It was very involved in global trade. As we've been discussing in this series already, we've already seen Africa as a thriving trade, world-connected continent that was very much thriving long before European thriving and Renaissance and all that stuff happened. Through Muslim intermediaries and trade and different groups and different people, we learned quite a whole lot. Last time we were here, we talked about slavery. Slavery was a big commodity to come out of the African continent. It is that commodity really that is going to change the face of the world. A lot of people don't realize when you have the discussion is that prior to 1492, there weren't African people that we know of in the New World. Now, there are speculations and there are theories and all kinds of things that are out there that perhaps Africans had gotten to the New World before Europeans. That we would never know at this moment. Maybe later on, as more history, more evidence suggests, we'll change that story, and that would be actually something cool to see. Nevertheless, what we do know is that due to this slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade that we'll talk about, Africans have been placed all over the world outside of the African continent, and that's how African Americans or Black people come to be. But we also know, as we spoke about last time, that slavery was not new to the African continent. Europeans didn't bring slavery to Africa. Europeans brought a different type of slave mentality to Africa, but they didn't bring the existence of slavery. Slavery has been something that has been in existence for many, many, many thousands of years. It is just kind of part of something that is in human civilization that we've had for quite a long time. And you know, it would be unfair to say that that's a European construct brought into Africa. It was existing. But as I said before, European slavery was different. So when we get into the conversation of the European slave trade, you will start to see some of the differences that are going to completely differ than what we've talked about when we talked about African slavery. But this particular episode is our final episode, so to speak, on dealing with Africa pre-colonialism, right? And I think I saved the best for last. I feel like I saved the best for last. The great African kingdoms. We've talked about quite a few things, but we hadn't really quite talked about those African kingdoms. And there were quite a few great African kingdoms that existed in the continent prior to European colonialism. The first that we'll talk about is the Great Kingdom of Ghana. Some call it Ouagadougou, but Ouagadougou was actually kind of a little localized state. That was the biggest state, but that is the original name, but that went on to be considered the Kingdom of Ghana. And it was some 500 miles where present-day Ghana sits to this day. The capital of the Ghanaian Empire was Kumbi-Sela, and it flourished and began to grow around the 7th century CE, modern time, right? AD, which is Common Era. But there's evidence that there were trinkets of it brewing as early as the 1st century CE. Basically, it kind of flourished mostly and expanded, as you can see in the pictures, around the grasslands near the Senegal and the Niger rivers. We know that leadership in Ghana was based on hereditary, right? A father has sons, or a father has a daughter, children, because there were also female leaders. And we kind of see that position of power transferred down. We also see that different leaders and different kind of officials were usually kin in a hereditary way in Ghana. And we also know that there was strata, that there was a stratification of society, right? So you had hierarchy. Remember when I showed you guys the pyramid in Europe? And if you go back to pretty much any early civilization, from the first noted, which was in Mesopotamia in the Near East, to Egypt, to China, to many other places in the Indus River Valley, hierarchy was just a common thing that humans do. This is not respective of any racial group. This is not respective of any of that stuff yet. Racism isn't a social construct in the moment that we're talking about now. When it gets there, we'll deal with it from that regard. That is a different experience that Europe brought in, was the racialization of hierarchy. Hierarchy generally had something to do with family, with religion, with resources, and those types of things. And so yes, there was hierarchy in the Ghanaian Empire. But they were a massive trade network. And around the 9th century, by the time we get to the 10th century, Kumbi-Sela is going to be a very important trade destination and section in this region that is going to be very connected to outside African trade. In fact, at some point, there will be sections in that area in Kumbi-Sela that is going to adopt Islam. They'll actually have a section off of the city that is specifically for the Islamic practitioners in that part of Africa. Why is that important? Well, we've already kind of discussed much of it in previous episodes when we talked about very connecting to the global trade network was Islamic trade. While Europe was stagnant and they were going through the quote-unquote off dark ages, as some put it, even though historians no longer use that, but while Europe wasn't involved in huge amounts of trade, Islamic traders were trading all over the world, and that includes Africa. So this places Kumbi-Sela into that market in the Ghanaian Empire. The Ghanaian leaders had a large army, and they also had a large trade network with these Islamic traders across the Sahara Desert and into northeastern and eastern Africa and off into the Near East and Middle East. We know of the story of these Ghanaian leaders and of this empire from travelers and from traders and from writers and geographers. People like al-Bakari, who was an Islamic historian and traveler who wrote about what he saw. And what he witnessed was the magnificence and the grandeur and the greatness of the Ghanaian Empire. One of the things he had wrote about was that the king of Ghana actually had a fairly huge army, an army that had about 200,000 men in it, where some 40,000 of them were archers, the bow and arrow. So it was a massive army, a 200,000 man army, when in some places cities weren't even 200,000 people, shows you the level of power that the Ghanaians had. And they traded all sorts of things with the Muslims and with those crossing the Sahara. Muslim countries from the Middle East and the Near East, they brought in things like salt, wheat, fruit, sugar, different things that they brought into trade that they were getting from other places and bringing with them. And the caravans would also bring things like textiles, brass, and pearls, and other things like that, salt. All of those things are being traded. What they would get from the Ghanaians and the leaders there would be things like ivory, gold, and of course, slaves. So you have kind of an interconnected large trade network that made Ghana a very powerful empire. There were also many different leaders amongst the way under the Ghanaian Empire, and they even taxed these traders. Islamic traders were being taxed. They had a whole tax system that Ghana was using to accumulate more money for their benefit and their kingdom. You have other empires that are underneath the Ghanaian Empire, like the Soninke. They're in Ghana. They're very wealthy. They're along the Gold Coast, and they're having a lot of gold items that they're trading with. But you have a lot of interconnected networks just within the Ghanaian Empire. One of the most famous leaders during this time, if not the most famous leader during this time, is Tunka Menin. He started to reign around 1063 CE. He ascended through the throne after his uncle, his maternal uncle, his mother's brother, died, and he ascended through the throne. I don't know if we said this last time, but just in case we didn't, which I'm sure we did, much of the power in Africa, unlike in Europe, which is a huge difference, went through the female line. And so because of that, kings and rulers and leaders were usually direct descendants of a mother's lineage. And so you'd see that happen quite often. But Tunka Menin is going to take over the power. And when where he lived was this huge palace. And this palace was well adorned with pictures and art. There was even a prison in this palace. It was a massive palace that he had in the Ghanaian Empire. Around the 11th century, we begin to see kind of a decline in the economic prowess of Ghana. And that left them pretty much open, because one of the things, just as any other empire across the world, is we begin to kind of see that you have, once you're vulnerable, there's always somebody there willing to take your place. If you're the most powerful nation, you have a lot of threats. Many of these empires had walled, fortified cities, simply because of the threat for attack. And so this left Ghana, this economic decline is going to leave Ghana in a position to where they are going to be vulnerable to impact and attacks. And so it is in this time that Mali, or Mele, another empire, another smaller empire, but it's gaining momentum, is going to come to power. And that is around more or less 1235 CE. Now mind you, we're talking in the modern era. So a lot of things that you guys know, perhaps maybe of European history, kind of like the Crusades and other things that are happening, this is all in the same time. This is just now we're focused on Africa, as we generally aren't. But this is African history, African American history, so of course we're going to focus where we are. So around 1235, Mali steps in. And after about a series of not so powerful leaders, not so successful, not so qualified leaders, you're actually going to see one leader come, and he's going to consolidate and strengthen the empire. And that leader is Sundiata Keita. Sundiata Keita. He originally started as a leader of the Malinka. Some people say Mandingo, but Malinka people. And he's going to succeed in a rebellion in the 13th century, which is going to bring Mali kind of dominating the Western Africa. Now, if you haven't noticed, we've been talking mostly about Western Africa. Why? Because this is African American history, black history. And so much of our history, even in the United States, over the course of the transatlantic slave trade, begins in Western Africa. So most of us pretty much originate from Western Africa. Sundiata is going to be able to consolidate the power. And therefore, Mali is going to take over Ghana's position. They're going to take over all the trade networks, and they're going to take over dominance over the gold. That was really a big resource for Ghana. In the 14th century, when Sundiata dies, a descendant of his named Mansa Musa is going to take Mali and bring Mali to a place where, higher heights, just exceedingly well beyond Sundiata, Mansa Musa is going to take it to a whole nother place. Now, some of you may say Mansa Musa, but it's really Mansa Musa. Depends on how you pronounce it, as long as you know who you're talking about, right? The Emperor of Ghana, the really strong, powerful Emperor of Ghana. He ruled from about 1312 to about 1337, and he was a remarkable, super, ultra powerful leader in Ghana. His empire comprised much of what we consider Francophone Africa today. And Francophone is French-speaking Africa. So where a lot of people speak French in Africa today, that's a huge amount. When the French went in, they took over a lot of territory. Much of that territory was ran and dominated and governed by Mansa Musa. Mali initially was primarily agriculturally based, but there were other things that they were doing. Obviously, they were mining gold. Obviously, they were trading slaves. Obviously, grains and other things, and animals and other types of things that they're also trading as well. Mansa Musa is a devout Muslim, right? He adopted Islam for the Mali Empire, and he was a devout Muslim. And if you know anything about the Islamic faith, one of the most important tenets of the faith is for an adherent to make the trip to Mecca. Mecca is the Holy Land. Mecca was where the religion was founded. Mecca is the home, the second home of Muhammad, kind of the father of the Islamic faith. And so it is kind of a requirement, if you can, to make it on that pilgrimage to Mecca. And many Muslims and adherents during this time were going to Mecca, going back and forth and going to the Holy Land. And Mansa Musa went to take his trip. On his way, he stopped into several well-known Islamic cities, but just world cities. He goes through Cairo, Mecca, Medina, all kinds of other places, and he leaves quite a lot of things, incredible things. He does quite a few incredible things. Let me start by saying, if you did not know, if you thought it was Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, if you thought any of these men were rich, they're nothing in comparison to what Mansa Musa had. Mansa Musa is the richest man to ever walk the planet. Yes, you heard that correctly. You got it right here. And if you didn't know it, now you know it. The richest person to ever live on the face of the earth was an African emperor from the kingdom of Mali named Mansa Musa. Richest person to ever live. He was such a generous person because another one of the Islamic tenets is alms to the poor. Giving to the poor. Helping out the poor. And so along the way, as he was going, he gave out so much gold and so much stuff, and he built mosques along the way, and he prayed with people, and he developed areas. He gave so much gold when he was in Egypt, just giving it out, making it rain, gave so much gold when he was in Egypt that he dropped the value of gold in Egypt for 10 years. Yeah, 10 years. And we know all of this because he also had travelers with him. He had Muslim architects and Muslim scholars and Muslim geographers and people who wrote his story down. His story went all the way through Africa, into the Middle East, and even made its way into Europe, where people were like, who is this powerful king? If you ever heard of the lion heart, in Europe we generally associate that with King Henry. Actually, the original Lionheart was Mansa Musa, right? When we talk about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords that makes its way into the Christian Bible, the King James Version of the Bible, that is what they called Mansa Musa even before the King James Version of the Bible was even documented. So you have this powerful king. And so when he died in 1337, Mali could boast one of the most powerful and well-organized states on the planet, right? It was wonderful. Now, I know some of you are wondering, well, just how rich was this guy? How rich was Mansa Musa? Well, some historians have calculated that his net worth was over about $400 billion. Yes, I said 400 billion with the B. Some people have calculated it to be that. But then most historians are just like, because of the times, because of inflation, because of many different factors, it's actually next to impossible to actually calculate what he would have been worth. Just know that he was the richest person to ever walk the face of the earth. And so there's a lot of history about him. Obviously, he's making a name for himself. The Arab travelers and Arab writers and geographers wrote about him. The most famous one is from a guy named Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta wrote quite a bit, and his writings were very powerful and very prominent and popular, and made their way through Europe. Because I've already said this before, but the Islamic travelers and writers and scholars, their information is going to be the information that's going to pass on Greek history and Roman history and early Indian history and a lot of things that we know, because it's going to be translated into various different languages. And so, of course, this information is being translated. And he mentions the organization, the development, the well put together, and all that stuff, and the grandeur of the Mali Empire under King Emperor Mansa Musa. It wasn't really until the 14th century that Europeans began to feel the effects of the trade, the global trade that's been going on, the commercial revolution that's been happening for at least 500-600 years prior to that time. But there was no state in Europe that can compare, that could resemble Mali under Mansa Musa. And his successor, Suleiman, had a powerful empire expanding hundreds of miles. Europe couldn't even touch it at the time. So this is kind of a big deal. So when Emperor Suleiman dies, there's going to be a civil war that is going to ensue. And that's going to begin around the 15th century. And with that, we're going to begin to see Mali lose a lot of its most important provinces. It's going to begin to show kind of signs of disintegration. There are going to be many attacks. One of the major players that's going to be attacking Mali at this time is going to be Songhai and the Mossi states. And so, despite its glory initially that they had before under Mansa Musa and under Suleiman, you're going to see Mali continue to exist for a few years as a small independent state. But the kingdom of Songhai is growing and growing and growing, and it's going to emerge triumphantly after the decline of Mali. Its roots are back to the Sorko people, which was kind of a small Songhai group that existed, living in the Gao region in the Niger River Valley area around the late 7th century. The region itself shows earlier pre-Sorko settlement patterns that we know in the late Stone Age, but in 1993, after excavating in that area, we actually unearthed pottery, copper, beads, hippopotamus tusk, funerary objects, and other things that date through the 9th through 12th centuries, which confirm that there were towns that were there before. And this had also corresponded and correlated to writings that Arab writers like al-Mulhabi had wrote about before. According to one scholar named Timothy Insole, the findings reveal that the entire Gao region was actually kind of an important terminus of trade with both the surrounding hitherland and the trans-Saharan between the 10th and the 13th century. The region also was composed of two settlements, the royal city of Old Gao, which was inhabited by the Sorko, and thus indigenous Africans, and the commercial city of Gao Sani, with the more diverse population of indigenous Africans, probably the Sorko, and some Arab people. When Songhai Ali, who is the leader of the Songhai, is going to come into power after a conquest through West Africa, he is going to achieve great dominance. What he's going to do is he's going to conquer, his plan at least was to conquer the entire Niger region by building a river navy. And in 1469, he's going to encounter and conquer two important cities. One, Timbuktu, and in 1473, he's going to conquer Djenné. And afterwards, he's going to move to other towns. Songhai Ali used the river vein system to his advantage, deploying his military forces on the Niger itself. They navigated the great river's waters in the conquest of the lands on both sides. Under him, under Songhai Ali, Songhai is going to be catapulted into a position of primary reign in West Africa. Once his successor is going to take power, Askia Muhammad, from about 1493 to 1529, the Songhai Empire is going to pretty much be the dominant empire across the entire Sahel region. Askia Muhammad is going to devote his energies to solidifying his empire, making his people prosperous, and engaging in learning and encouraging learning. And he's going to build a professional large army of slaves and of prisoners of war, and those are going to be his subjects under the kingdom. Askia Muhammad is going to take Songhai more places than it had ever been before. And he's going to have these different leaders, one of which is his actual brother named Omar, who is going to help extend the kingdom further and further and further. And because of that, Songhai is going to be by far the largest and most powerful and most prominent state in the history of West Africa. So this is a big deal, and you got kind of this massive empire now. So remember, we've gone from Ghana to Mali to now Songhai being this large, super successful kingdom. And they're going to be engaged in so many stuff, in so much stuff. Askia Muhammad, who's a Muslim, is going to make his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1497. Now, if you know your dates, you know in 1492, that's when Columbus makes his first voyage across the Atlantic to the Americas. So this is happening around the same time. He doubtless believed that the journey would prove profitable in many ways. What he's going to do is he's going to have an escort, about 1,500 men with him. And his followers are going to talk with doctors, mathematicians, scientists, and scholars, and they're going to learn a lot about how to improve their government and their administration, how to codify their laws, how to foster industry and how to trade, and how to raise the intellectual level of the country. Even Askia Muhammad's investiture as Caliph of the Sudan can be interpreted as a move to strengthen his country. And if you know anything about the different caliphs, you got them in Cairo, you got them in Baghdad, you got them in many different places as far as even in Spain. And he's the Caliph of the Sudan. When he returns, Askia Muhammad is going to institute many of the reforms that he has learned. He's going to assign carefully chosen governors called Fari to rule over subdivisions of his empire. He's going to reorganize the army and appoint chiefs, or Noi, and administer provinces in large cities. Islamic law and the Quran served as the basis for his administering his justice. In the area of economic life, banking and credit are going to be improved. A uniform system of weights and measures are going to be established, and scales are going to be inspected. The people of Songhai were encouraged to trade with other countries. Trade from Europe and Asia traders from Europe and Asia visited the markets of Gao, which was the political center of Songhai and home of the royal dynasties, and also Timbuktu, which was an important place of learning on the planet. It was education that was Askia Muhammad's most important, significant reform. Not only Timbuktu, but also Gao, Walata, and Jenne became intellectual centers where the most learned scholars of West Africa concentrated. By the 16th and 17th centuries, a distinctly Sudanese literature was emerging. Timbuktu's University of Sankore offered studies in grammar, geography, law, literature, and surgery. In 1512, Leo Africanus, a Muslim converted to Christianity whose travels account for a long time were Europeans, his travel accounts were of Europeans, he writes about Timbuktu and the great doctors and judges and priests and other learned men that were under this Songhai kingdom. The great power of Songhai was not to last. Muhammad was dethroned by his oldest son, and civil wars, massacres, and unsuccessful military expeditions followed. Although there were a brief period of revival, the empire was definitely declining. The Moors viewed the Sudan convulsively and began to push across the desert. With Spanish renegades as their allies, Moroccans overthrew the Songhai state and began their own brief rule in Timbuktu. Songhai became this massive empire that gained a lot of respect all over the world, and people began to travel there just to be educated, as Askia Muhammad wanted. Askia Muhammad and other leaders of these massive empires, be it Mali, be it Songhai, be it Ghana, they realized how difficult it was to rule some of the vast territory that they had. And they often had clashes with some of the other leaders of some of the more smaller states that were under their control. And so what would happen is these leaders would want to do their own things, would have their own reforms, and sometimes would interact negatively with the administrators of the larger empire. And so, for example, we know along his way to Mecca, as he dictated and had it written down, his words, Mansa Musa found a great difficulty trying to convert the people along the way to Islam. So thereafter, what he did is he and many other of the leaders of, whether it was Mali, Songhai, or any other state, decided to just allow the people to practice their local customs. And so what you begin to see is actually a mixture, kind of a melding, a blending of the religion sometimes, or you just see people under the smaller states practice their religion as well as, and then others practice Islam or whatever dominant religion was there. Another space where we see kind of a dominant new religion coming into Africa is in the Christian Congo. So let's talk more about the Christian Congo. The Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa was founded around the 14th century. It was unique because they converted to Christianity. Congolese King Nzinga Nkubu asked Portuguese priests to baptize him in 1491, and he adopted the baptismal name of João I and established military and trade relations with Portugal and allowed Portuguese merchants and priests into his kingdom. However, in Congo, Africans and not the Portuguese controlled the church, and thus Catholic worship melded indigenous religions and these religious beliefs and practices with Christianity. Christian beliefs introduced by the Portuguese complemented and reinforced local Congo traditions, such as the cruciform cross, which already existed as an indigenous symbol, and powerful transitional space for communication between the earthly and the divine. Congo leaders use Christian symbology, like the crucifix, as vehicles for communicating with deities and ancestors, merging the secular and the spiritual crucifixes and the spiritual world together. Crucifixes were used to invoke divine favor in matters such as weather, hunting, and fertility, and played a significant role in the proceedings and rain-making rituals. And we call that syncretism. So like Congo, there were also other empires that exist that we have yet to mention. You had the Kingdom of Benin that was extended all the way to Lagos. They were known for their copper artistry and producing different things based on different metals. They were actually had a domination over the different metals in the iron and different metals in the area. They had a substantial military. They also believed and respected male and female authority, so you actually see that, and that's actually visible in some of their statues. They also had elections. When Europeans actually got there and encountered the African rulers in the 16th and 17th century, they encountered some of these Benin rulers, and they realized that they were having elections, that some of these people were elected officials. And that was actually kind of a coup. So you got different empires, and we've named quite a few. We've named others, and there's some that we have that were all over other parts of Africa. But remember, we're focusing on Western Africa, but you have many other kingdoms like Egypt and Kush and Carthage and Ethiopia and the Great Zimbabwe. You know, you have a lot of different African kingdoms that we haven't even mentioned at all in this series. So Africa was full. Africa had quite a lot going on. It was not at all just this quiet, dark, uninhabited, undeveloped territory as had been the case long before. What we've talked about in these last 3 episodes, we've talked about Africa being a thriving area of trade, a thriving area of many different kinds of trades, from salt to grains to animal livestock to slaves to gold to many different things. What we have also talked about is that Africa is diverse. So this conversation that African Americans all come from the same space, mind, place, ancestry is just fundamentally false. We come from a very diverse, mixed group of ethnic groups that spoke different languages, that had different experiences. Not all of us were Christian coming out. Some of us were. Some of us were Muslims. Some of us had our own, most of us really, had our own indigenous religious beliefs from Africa. So we were diverse religiously as well. What we also talked about is these great, powerful kingdoms that were so great and powerful that they were being heard all over the known world at that time, like Mansa Musa in Mali, and Ghana, and Songhai, and Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe. So Africa was great. Africa was thriving. And yes, just like any other civilization, it had its stuff. There were wars, and there was slavery, and there were different things going on, and hierarchy, and the stuff that we see in all civilizations, but that's human, right? And so, but we see Africa as part of that history, as part of that story. There are many, many resources that you can find if you want to know more about African history. You can find videos on YouTube, you can go to your local libraries, you can go to the internet and Google and learn in detail. So because we only have 30 minutes here, so we can't get into everything, but you guys can find out more about African history because it is a rich, powerful history, the most powerful history at the time during the height of its day, and it was very much connected to the rest of the world. So, hopefully you've learned much about Africa. Hopefully you learned the origins of African American people, because now we have to go and transition from where all that gets broken apart, all that gets changed, and you're going to get people of African descent who are going to be traversed across the Atlantic Ocean into a new world, into a new experience, and to create a new identity, because most of this history, this great history of Africa, is going to be stripped from them. So that's it for today. But when we come back next time, next week, we will talk about when Europeans coming to Africa and when they begin this transatlantic trade of different resources. But the most prominent resources that the Europeans who are going to the Americas are going to get out of Africa are going to be people. And those people are going to be the ancestors of African Americans today. So I hope to see you next time. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Discuss the videos, share the videos, learn from the videos, leave comments. Let's have a discussion. That's what we're here to do. Hopefully you are enjoying it, so make sure you're sharing it, make sure you're liking it, make sure you're learning from it.